My name is Captain Alicia Moss. I'm 34 years old, an officer in the United States Army, and the biggest disappointment to the most powerful military dynasty in Washington, D.C. 3 months ago, I was at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center watching my mother, General Eleanor Moss, take her final breath. While the woman who built a defense empire lay dying, my perfect siblings were nowhere to be seen. My brother, Colonel Marcus Moss, was performing a flyover for some VIPs. My sister Victoria was at the Pentagon, closing a billion-dollar deal. Not one of the 47 decorated officers in my family showed up. To them, she was already gone, a used-up asset. The silence in that room was a judgment, a final declaration that she, and by extension I, were irrelevant. But as the nurse handed me my mother's final letter, I realized this wasn't a surrender. It was a declaration of war. A war she had been planning for 15 years, and I was her secret weapon. Before I tell you what that letter contained, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like and subscribe button if you believe that true strength is often the kind that goes unseen and unheard by the people who are supposed to love you most. The air in my mother's room at Walter Reed was a sterile cocktail of antiseptic and quiet despair. It was a scent I'd come to know intimately over the last 6 weeks, a smell that clung to my uniform long after I left the hospital grounds. Outside, the world moved on. Inside this room, time was measured in the steady, metronomic beep of the heart monitor. Each pulse was a reminder of what I was losing. Each beat felt more like a countdown than a sign of life. I sat in the stiff visitor's chair, my hand wrapped around my mother's. Her skin was like parchment paper, stretched thin over the bones of a hand that once signed directives that could shift the global balance of power. General Eleanor Moss, the Iron Matriarch. Now, her face was a landscape of surrender, her breathing a shallow whisper against the starched white pillowcase. The woman who had commanded armies was now being defeated by her own cells. The pain of watching her fade was a physical weight, a pressure behind my ribs that never eased. My thumb traced the back of her hand as I pulled out my phone. A reflex, a desperate, foolish habit. I stared at the screen, its cold light illuminating the truth in stark, unforgiving pixels. No new messages, no missed calls. The call log was a monument to my own futile attempts to reach out. The last communication from my sister, Victoria, was a clipped text from 2 days ago. Any change? Not. How is she? Or, how are you holding up? Just a sterile, efficient inquiry, as if asking for a market update. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that they had received the latest update from the doctors. The final one. The one that said, hours, not days. But they had chosen. Marcus, my brother, the ace fighter pilot, had chosen the roar of a crowd and the glory of an air show. Victoria, the ruthless executive, had chosen the cold calculus of a billion-dollar contract for Moss Defense Dynamics, our mother's company. Their choices were louder and more painful than the impending silence of the heart monitor. They weren't just absent, they were broadcasting their indifference. A tremor of anger, hot and sharp, cut through my grief. I had to know. I needed to hear it from him to confirm the depth of this betrayal. Taking a deep, shaky breath that tasted of chemical cleaners, I found Marcus's name in my contacts and pressed the call button. It rang 3 times before he picked up. The sound of his voice was muffled by the roar of jet engines in the background. He didn't even say hello. Alicia, I'm in the middle of a pre-flight briefing. Is it done yet? The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Is it done yet? Not. How is she? Not. I'm on my way. He wasn't asking about our mother, he was asking about an inconvenient task, a box to be checked so he could move on with his life, unburdened. The glorious Colonel Moss couldn't be distracted from his performance by the trivial matter of his mother's death. The cruelty of it, so casual and absolute, stole the air from my lungs. A wave of nausea washed over me. This was a new level of cold, a betrayal so pure it was almost breathtaking. I couldn't form a sentence. I couldn't scream at him, couldn't beg him to have an ounce of humanity. All the fight drained out of me, replaced by a hollow, ringing emptiness. The only sound I could manage was a whisper, a single word that felt like I was swallowing glass. Almost, I said. Then I ended the call. I didn't throw the phone. I didn't break down. As a soldier, I had been trained to compartmentalize, to function under fire. And in that moment, I understood that I was in a combat zone of a different kind. I placed the phone face down on the small bedside table and turned my full attention back to my mother, giving her the dignity in death that her other children denied her. The beeping of the monitor slowed, becoming erratic. Each beat was followed by a longer, more agonizing pause. I squeezed her hand gently, my voice low and steady. "It's okay, Mom. You can rest now. I'm here." And then, it happened. The rhythmic beep was replaced by a single, high-pitched, unending tone. The green line on the screen, the one that had charted the final chapter of her life, flattened into a stark, unwavering horizon. She was gone. The silence that descended on the room was absolute. It was heavier than grief, emptier than loss. It was the sound of total, profound abandonment. In the end, after building an empire, after raising a family of so-called warriors, the only person by General Eleanor Moss's side was me, her paper-pusher daughter. The disappointment. The quiet strategist in a family that only valued the sound of explosions and applause. A few minutes later, an Army nurse captain, a woman with kind eyes and a career's worth of compassion etched into her face, entered the room. She performed her duties with a quiet reverence before turning to me. "Captain," she said softly, holding out a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with wax. "Your mother told me to give this only to you. She was very specific. She said you would know what to do." My fingers trembled as I took it. The envelope felt heavy, important. I broke the seal. Inside, on a single sheet of her personal stationery, was my mother's handwriting. It was weak, shaky, but the lines were filled with an unmistakable strength, a commander's intent. The first sentence wasn't a farewell. It wasn't a word of love or a message of peace. It was an order. "Alicia, the war begins now." War. The word felt alien in the crushing silence of that hospital room. A war against whom? My own family? It sounded like madness. But as I clutched that letter, my mind was violently pulled back 2 years to a glittering ballroom at the Army-Navy Club. That was the night I finally understood. For them, the war against me had started long ago. Holding my mother's final letter, the word war echoed in the sterile silence of her hospital room. It felt surreal, a command disconnected from the quiet reality of her passing. But my family had never fought their wars on conventional battlefields. Their combat zones were boardrooms, press conferences, and glittering Washington, D.C. galas. The memory that surfaced wasn't from my time in service, but from 2 years prior at the annual Moss Foundation Gala. It was there, under the weight of crystal chandeliers and political ambition, that I truly understood my place, or lack thereof, in the Moss dynasty. The event was held at the Army-Navy Club, a historic institution on Farragut Square that felt less like a club and more like a fortress of the military-industrial complex. The air inside was thick with the scent of old leather, expensive bourbon, and the quiet hum of power being exchanged. It was a place where careers were made or broken over a handshake. Generals with chests full of medals mingled with senators, and defense contractor CEOs spoke in hushed, important tones. I arrived in my Army service uniform, the deep blue jacket and sharply creased trousers a source of immense pride for me. But as I stepped into the grand ballroom, that pride curdled into a familiar feeling of invisibility. I was an island of simple, functional wool in a sea of $1,000 tuxedos and designer gowns. Every woman there, including my sister Victoria, wore shimmering fabrics and carefully selected jewelry. I felt plain, out of place, a soldier in a room full of politicians and peacocks. Across the room, I spotted my brother, Marcus, holding court. He was in his dress uniform, a constellation of medals on his chest, regaling a powerful senator with what I knew was a slightly exaggerated tale of a near miss over the Persian Gulf. He was in his element, the center of attention, the warrior prince, the living embodiment of the Moss family brand. He didn't see me arrive. Or if he did, He didn't acknowledge it. As guests began to move towards their tables, I searched for my name on the seating chart. I found it, not at the head table with my mother, Marcus, and Victoria, but at table 14, tucked away in the back corner near the service entrance. It was the aides table, a polite term for the place you stick the junior officers and assistants you're obligated to invite but don't actually want to talk to. The message was as clear as the crystal glasses on the main table. I was staff, not family. Steeling myself, I made my way through the maze of tables. As I passed the head table, my sister Victoria looked up, a perfectly feigned smile of surprise on her face. Her voice was just loud enough for the generals and their wives seated nearby to hear. "Oh, Alicia, you made it," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "We saved a spot for you over there." She gestured vaguely towards the back of the room. "You'll be more comfortable with your peers." The polite smiles of the people at her table didn't quite mask their pitying glances. I felt a hot flush creep up my neck, but I kept my expression neutral. Years of practice had taught me how to absorb these little cuts without flinching. I simply nodded and gave her the smile I'd perfected my entire life, the one that said, "That doesn't bother me at all." I took my seat at table 14, among lieutenants who looked at me with a mixture of awe and confusion, wondering why a captain with my last name was sitting with them. The true humiliation, however, came later. After the filet mignon was served and the wine had been poured, Marcus took the stage to give the keynote address. He was charming, of course. He spoke of legacy, of service, of the warrior spirit that defined the Moss family, and by extension, Moss defense dynamics. He paced the stage, owning the spotlight, his voice resonating with practiced confidence. Then his eyes found me in the back of the room. A slow, smug smile spread across his face. "And of course," he said, his voice booming through the speakers, "we can't forget those who serve from the great indoors." He paused for effect as a few polite chuckles rippled through the audience. "While some of us are pulling G's in a cockpit," he continued, gesturing to himself, "others are ensuring the Wi-Fi is strong." The room erupted in laughter. It wasn't mean-spirited from their perspective. It was just a good line, a joke from a charismatic pilot. But for me, it was a public execution. He had taken my career, my expertise in cyber warfare, a field he knew nothing about, and reduced it to an IT support punchline. He did it in front of our entire world, and he did it with a smile. I felt the blood rush to my face, a burning wave of shame and rage, but I did what I always did. I smiled back. I nodded as if I was in on the joke. It was a performance, and it was exhausting. From the head table, I saw my mother's reaction. She wasn't laughing. But she wasn't angry either. She just had a tired smile on her face, a look of weary resignation. In that moment, I understood. She wasn't going to defend me. She had given up trying to bridge the gap between her children. She had chosen the path of least resistance, and that path left me standing alone. I don't remember the rest of the dinner. I excused myself as soon as it was polite to do so, and walked out into the cool DC night. I got into my car, a simple Honda that felt worlds away from the Blacktown cars lining the street, and I just drove. I ended up parked by the Potomac River, with the lights of the Kennedy Center shimmering on the dark water. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to cry. They weren't quiet, dignified tears. They were the raw, ugly sobs of a lifetime of being pushed aside. I wasn't just crying over Marcus's joke. I was crying for the deliberate cruelty of my sister. I was crying for the complicity of the laughing crowd. But most of all, I was crying for my mother's tired smile. That broke my heart more than anything. It was the moment I realized I was truly, completely on my own. If you've ever been made to feel small by the very people who should have built you up, please hit that like button to show some support. And in the comments below, just type the words, "I see you." Because sometimes that's all we ever really need. After the tears stopped, a cold resolve settled in my gut. I drove home, not to sleep, but to work. I sat in my small Arlington apartment, surrounded by the glow of 3 monitors, and I poured all of that pain, all of that rage, into my work. I stayed up until 4 a.m., dissecting a complex piece of malware for a cyber command project. It was the only arena where I had control. The only place where my value wasn't determined by my family, but by my skill. It was the only battlefield where I knew I could win. The vow I made to myself that night by the Potomac, to build my own legacy, one line of code at a time, wasn't just empty sentiment, it became my creed. In a family that measured worth in medals and headlines, I decided my value would be measured in results, even if I was the only one who saw them. I poured myself into my work at Cyber Command, building a reputation among my colleagues as a sharp, relentless analyst. But it was a crisis at my mother's own company, Moss Defense Dynamics, that truly tested my resolve. The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Saturday in the fall of 2019. I was on a rare weekend leave, trying to decompress with a hike planned in Shenandoah National Park the next morning. The caller ID flashed Victoria Moss. My sister never called me unless it was an emergency, and never in the middle of the night. I answered, and her voice was a whip crack of panic and authority. "We have a breach, a major one." There was no preamble, no, "sorry to wake you." She explained that the MDD servers had been hit by a sophisticated ransomware attack. A group believed to be state-sponsored had bypassed their security and was threatening to leak the proprietary schematics for our next-generation drone project, a project worth billions. "Our contractors are useless," she snapped. "Some of the best cybersecurity firms in DC, and they're all stumped. They can't stop the data bleed." There was a pause, and I could practically hear her swallowing her pride. "I need you." Then the inevitable command, "Fix it. Now." I didn't hesitate. My hiking trip evaporated from my mind. This wasn't about helping Victoria. This was about protecting my mother's life's work. "Send me the access credentials," I said, already kicking off my blankets and heading towards my computer. For the next 72 hours, my small Arlington apartment became a cyber warfare command center. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. My world shrank to the glow of 3 monitors, the click of my keyboard, and the bitter taste of black coffee. I lived on protein bars and the adrenaline of the hunt. The complexity of the attack was staggering. The hackers had buried their entry point under layers of proxies, routing their signal through servers in a dozen different countries. It was a digital ghost hunt, and the fate of MDD was the prize. While my brother was likely flying in perfect formation and my sister was managing frantic conference calls, I was fighting a war in the shadows. I was alone, tracing phantom signals, writing patches on the fly, and building a new, more robust digital firewall from scratch. It was a grueling, thankless battle fought in a language my family didn't understand, but the consequences of my failure would have been catastrophic. Their empire, their legacy, it was all resting on the Wi-Fi expert they so casually dismissed. At the 72-hour mark, exhausted and running on fumes, I found the back door they'd used. I sealed it, purged their malware from the system, and locked them out for good. The final data packet they'd tried to steal was stopped just before it left our network. The threat was neutralized. I leaned back in my chair, the tension draining from my shoulders, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep weariness. I typed out a short professional email to Victoria. Subject: MDD Network Security Incident Body. Threat neutralized. System secured. I hit send and finally allowed myself to sleep. 6 hours later, my phone buzzed with her reply. I opened the email, my heart harboring a tiny, foolish flicker of hope for a word of thanks, of acknowledgement. The email contained a single word. Noted. That was it. No thank you. No, great job. Just noted. As if I had just informed her that the office coffee machine was restocked. The emptiness I felt in that moment was profound. It was a cold, hollow ache that settled deep in my chest. A few weeks later, that ache turned into a quiet, simmering rage. I was scrolling through my newsfeed when I saw an article from Defense News, a major industry publication. The headline read, "Victoria Moss on MDD's Impenetrable Cyber Defenses." The article featured a large, glossy photo of my sister, looking powerful and confident. In the interview, she boasted about their proactive security strategy. At MDD, she was quoted as saying, "We believe in being prepared. We've invested millions in building a state-of-the-art, impenetrable cybersecurity infrastructure to protect our assets and national security. I read the words over and over. We've invested millions. She made it sound like a calculated corporate strategy, not a last-ditch phone call to the sister she despised. My 72-hour battle had been erased, repackaged as a line item on her budget, a talking point to impress the Pentagon. It wasn't just about saving the company from disaster. I was actively trying to make it better. Over the next 6 months, I dedicated my spare time, nights, weekends, to developing a new AI-driven logistics algorithm. I knew MDD's supply chain was inefficient, and my algorithm was designed to optimize it, predicting parts shortages and rerouting shipments in real time. My projections showed it could save the company over $20 million in its first year alone. I scheduled a meeting and presented it to Victoria in her sterile, glass-walled office. She listened with an impatient air, tapping her pen on her desk. When I finished, she simply nodded. "Good," she said, her eyes already on her next meeting. She copied the files from my drive to her laptop. "Send my assistant the documentation." Then came the final, casual dismissal. "I have a real meeting to get to." My months of work, my innovation, were not a real meeting. They were just a task to be delegated. My algorithm was implemented, and just as I predicted, it saved MDD $23 million that year. That number appeared as a highlight in the annual shareholder report attributed to Victoria's strategic streamlining initiatives. My name was nowhere to be found. That feeling of being utterly invisible, of having my contributions erased, became my new normal. I expected nothing, so I was never disappointed. And then, a few months later, I received an email that changed everything. It wasn't from my family. It was from a 3-star general I barely knew named David Campbell. He wanted to talk about my work. After years of being treated as either an inconvenience or an invisible asset by my own family, I had learned to expect nothing. Recognition was a foreign currency in the Moss dynasty, a currency I didn't possess. So when the email from Lieutenant General David Campbell landed in my inbox, my first reaction was suspicion. Generals didn't typically send personal emails to captains. I assumed it was a mistake, a message meant for someone else. I'd met him only once, a few months prior, when he visited my unit at Fort Meade. Most general officer visits were a blur of polished boots and PowerPoint presentations. They'd get a high-level briefing, ask a few standard questions about metrics and readiness, shake some hands, and leave. But General Campbell was different. Instead of the usual 5-minute overview, he sat down with me in a small windowless briefing room for nearly 2 hours. He didn't care about the metrics on the slides. He wanted to understand the philosophy behind the cyber defense strategies I was developing. He leaned forward, his gaze intense and focused, asking sharp, insightful questions that showed he wasn't just hearing my words. He was processing them, analyzing them. He challenged my assumptions and pushed me to think 3 steps ahead. It was the most intellectually stimulating conversation I'd had in years. As he was preparing to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at me. "Captain," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "your mind is a weapon system. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." The words struck me with such force that I was momentarily speechless. In a world that only saw my brother's cockpit and my sister's balance sheets, this man saw my mind as a tool of war, a strategic asset. It was the first time in my entire career that a senior officer had validated my work in such a profound way. A few months after that meeting, I was chosen to lead a team in a major NATO cyber warfare exercise. For a week, we defended our network against a simulated onslaught from some of the best offensive cyber teams in the world. It was a brutal, relentless exercise, but my team performed flawlessly. We not only repelled the attacks, but we also successfully counterattacked, exploiting a vulnerability in the enemy network that no one else had spotted. We won. 2 days later, the email from General Campbell arrived. It wasn't a generic "congratulations." It was a detailed analysis of the entire exercise. He broke down 3 of my most critical strategic decisions, explaining exactly why they were so effective. He had noticed a subtle piece of honeypot code I'd embedded as a trap, a detail that even the exercise controllers had missed in their initial debrief. He had taken the time to study my work, to understand its nuances. For the first time, I felt something I hadn't realized I was starving for. I felt seen. The real turning point, however, came that Thanksgiving. It was always a difficult holiday. The Moss family Thanksgiving was a large formal affair at my mother's estate in McLean, a performance of family unity for the benefit of political guests. I had decided to skip it that year, claiming I had duty, unwilling to endure another round of polite dismissals and veiled insults. On the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, my phone rang. It was General Campbell. "Captain Moss," he said, his voice warm and relaxed. "My wife Sarah and I were wondering what your plans are for the holiday. If you're not tied up, we'd be honored if you'd join our family for dinner." I was stunned into silence. I eventually managed to stammer out that I'd be happy to. Their home in Annapolis was nothing like the cold, museum-like mansion I grew up in. It was a cozy, two-story house that smelled of cinnamon, roasting turkey, and wood smoke from the fireplace. His children, both in college, were home for the holiday, and they welcomed me with genuine warmth. The whole house was filled with laughter and the easy comfort of a family that actually enjoyed each other's company. I sat at their dining room table, which was laden with classic Thanksgiving food: a perfectly browned turkey, creamy mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and homemade cranberry sauce. It was a simple, all-American meal, yet it felt more nourishing than any of the catered feasts I'd ever had at home. During dinner, Sarah Campbell, a kind woman with a quick smile, asked me about my family. "Are they all in the DC area, Alicia?" I felt a familiar tension grip my stomach. I gave my standard, vague answer. "Yes, ma'am, they're all here, just very busy." General Campbell must have seen the flicker of discomfort in my eyes. He seamlessly interjected, changing the subject. "You know, my son here is thinking about a computer science major. Alicia, maybe you could tell him what it's really like on the front lines of cyber warfare." He gave me a small, knowing nod. He had provided an escape route, and I was immensely grateful. After dinner, as the family was clearing the table and arguing over which football game to watch, the general motioned for me to join him on the back porch. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the salty scent of the nearby Chesapeake Bay. We stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, watching the last light of day fade over the water. "Alicia, I knew your mother," he began, his voice thoughtful. "I served with her years ago. She was a brilliant strategist, one of the best I've ever seen. But she was trapped by the very traditions she upheld, by the image of the Moss dynasty." He turned to look at me. "She was always focused on the last war. You see the next one." He took a step closer, his expression serious. "The future of warfare isn't in bigger tanks or faster jets, Alicia. It's in smarter networks and more resilient data streams. That's your battlefield. You have a gift for it. Don't fight their war. Make them fight yours." He then quoted one of his heroes, General George S. Patton. "Accept the challenges so that you can feel the exhilaration of victory." Walking away from his house that night, I felt a shift inside me. His words weren't just advice, they were permission. Permission to stop trying to fit into my family's narrow definition of success. Permission to embrace my own strengths, to fight on my own terms. I didn't know it then, but that newfound strength would be tested sooner than I could have ever imagined. The following week, my sister Victoria sent a text that felt like a summons. The cold fury that had settled over me at the Hay Adams didn't dissipate as I walked out into the bustling DC afternoon. It solidified. The $50,000 insult wasn't just another slight, it was the final straw. It was the clarifying event that burned away all doubt, all hesitation, all lingering traces of the dutiful daughter I had tried to be. They had drawn their line, and now I would draw mine. My call to Arthur Morrison was the first shot fired in my counteroffensive. His law firm, Morrison and Associates, was located in a discreet brownstone in Georgetown, a world away from the flashy glass towers preferred by most corporate lawyers. Mr. Morrison was old-school DC, wise, impeccably dressed, and fiercely loyal. He had been my mother's personal attorney and confidant for over 30 years. I walked into his office, the smell of old books and leather instantly calming my frayed nerves. He stood up from behind his massive oak desk, his expression somber but kind. He had already offered his condolences, so we dispensed with the pleasantries. I placed my mother's letter, the one I'd received at the hospital, on his desk blotter. "Mr. Morrison," I said, my voice clear and steady. "General Moss's final order. It's time." He nodded slowly, a flicker of something, sadness but also resolve, in his eyes. He didn't need any further explanation. He walked over to a large antique safe tucked behind a painting of the Supreme Court. He spun the dial with practiced hands, the clicks echoing in the quiet room. The heavy door swung open, and he pulled out a thick, leather-bound portfolio. "Your mother foresaw this day, Captain," he said, placing the portfolio on the desk with a soft thud. "She hoped it would never come to this, but she was a strategist. She always planned for every contingency." He opened it, revealing a meticulously organized set of documents. "Every paper is in place. The trust is ironclad. They won't know what hit them." For the first time since my mother's death, I felt a surge of profound, heartbreaking clarity. She hadn't been weak or resigned that day at the Army-Navy Club. She had been playing the long game. She had been quietly forging the very weapon I now held in my hands. The following week was a blur of calculated action. I took a leave of absence from my post, and my Arlington apartment transformed from a quiet refuge into an intelligence operations center. The grief was still there, a constant ache beneath the surface, but I channeled it. Pain became fuel. Sorrow became strategy. Using my signals intelligence skills, I began to build a complete picture of the enemy. I analyzed every public financial report from Moss Defense Dynamics, cross-referencing them with SEC filings and industry news. I set up alerts to track Marcus's and Victoria's digital footprints, monitoring their known associates and business dealings. It was what I was trained to do: collect, analyze, and act. Within days, I found what I was looking for. A series of encrypted communications and discreet meetings between Marcus and a senior executive at Ares Global Security. Ares was a ruthless international arms conglomerate known for cutting corners and prioritizing profits over the safety of the soldiers who used their equipment. They were everything my mother despised. Digging deeper, I uncovered the horrifying truth. Marcus was in the final stages of negotiating a secret deal to sell a controlling interest in MDD to Ares. It wasn't just about greed. The deal included a personal consulting fee for him, a $50 million kickback. He was planning to sell our mother's legacy, to gut the company she built, and to endanger the lives of American soldiers with inferior products, all for a payday. This was no longer just a family dispute. This was treason to everything our family was supposed to stand for. With the enemy's plan exposed, it was time to rally my own forces. My mother's letter contained a short, encrypted addendum with 5 names. These were her loyalists, former executives, engineers, and board members who had been pushed out by Marcus and Victoria's aggressive takeover after our mother's health began to fail. I began contacting them, one by one, using secure channels. My first meeting was with Dr. Robert Sterling, the former head of research and development, at a quiet coffee shop in Bethesda. He was a brilliant engineer in his late 60s, forced into early retirement by Victoria, who saw his rigorous safety standards as an impediment to profit. When I showed him the evidence of Marcus's deal with Ares, his face grew pale with anger. He then handed me a flash drive. "Your brother started cutting the budget for composite materials on the drone project 6 months ago," he said, his voice trembling with fury. "He replaced them with a cheaper, inferior alternative from an Ares subsidiary. These are the internal test results he buried. The materials are failing under stress." Each meeting yielded another piece of the puzzle, another weapon for my arsenal. The former CFO gave me proof of Victoria's creative accounting. The lead engineer for the drone project gave me the original, uncompromised schematics. My quiet army was assembling. On a cold, late afternoon, the day before the preliminary will reading was scheduled, I drove to Arlington National Cemetery. The endless rows of white headstones stood in silent, solemn formation under a gray sky. I found my mother's grave, a simple, standard-issue marker, right next to my father's. I placed a single white rose on the cold marble. I didn't cry. The time for tears was over. Instead, I stood at attention, brought my hand up in a sharp military salute, and spoke to her in a whisper the wind carried away. I understand now, Mom. It's not about revenge. It's about protecting your legacy. I will not fail. In that moment, standing among the nation's heroes, the weight of my grief transformed into the weight of my mission. I was no longer the wounded daughter. I was Captain Alicia Moss, United States Army, and I was executing my commander's final order. If you believe that protecting a legacy of integrity is worth fighting for, hit that like button. And let me know in the comments, which one word describes a person who turns their pain into power? Leaving Arlington, the path forward was clear. My mother had given me a mission, a map, and a list of allies. Marcus and Victoria thought this was a battle for money and control. They were wrong. This was a battle for the soul of a company and the protection of a legacy. My mother gave me a mission. Now it was time to execute it. The preliminary reading of my mother's will was scheduled in the main conference room of Mr. Morrison's law firm. I knew, with the certainty of a soldier walking into an ambush, that it was a trap. Marcus and Victoria weren't interested in legal formalities. They were interested in a public display of power, a final coronation of their authority over the Moss dynasty. And I was meant to be the final subject to be brought to heel. When I walked into the room, my assessment was confirmed. It was a perfectly executed psychological operation. All 47 members of the Moss clan, aunts, uncles, cousins, all decorated officers or executives, were already seated. They formed a silent, intimidating wall of judgment around the massive mahogany table. As I entered, a calculated hush fell over the room. No one made eye contact. No one offered a word of greeting. It was a coordinated, disciplined shunning, designed to isolate and intimidate me before a single word of the will was read. At the head of the table, Marcus sat like a king holding court, a smug, proprietary air about him. Victoria sat to his right, her expression a mask of cool indifference. I took the only empty seat, a single chair placed slightly apart from the others, the physical manifestation of my status as an outsider. In the far corner of the room, sitting quietly in a guest chair, was General David Campbell. I had invited him to act as my official military advisor, a request that was unusual but perfectly within my rights. His presence was my first strategic move, a silent signal that I was not entirely alone. Mr. Morrison began the proceedings, his voice a dry murmur. But before he could get past the introductory clauses, Marcus held up a hand, cutting him off. He fixed his gaze on me, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Alicia, let's just cut to the chase," he said, the picture of magnanimous authority. "This is a formality. As you well know, Mother's will leaves the controlling shares of Moss Defense Dynamics to Victoria and me." He paused, letting the weight of his pronouncement settle over the silent room. "There's nothing for you here." His words were a final, public dismissal. "You are irrelevant. You have no power here." The assembled family members shifted in their seats, their faces a mixture of pity and satisfaction. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the official confirmation of my insignificance, and that was my cue. Right on schedule, my phone, which I had placed face up on the table, began to vibrate. The call was precisely timed, a digital artillery strike I had arranged the day before. I glanced at General Campbell. He caught my eye and gave me a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. I answered the call and immediately pressed the speakerphone button. The room was so quiet that the electronic chirp of the connection seemed to echo off the wood-paneled walls. "Captain Moss," a deep, authoritative voice boomed from the small speaker. "This is General Peterson from the Pentagon's Cyber Command." A ripple of shock went through the room. General Frank Peterson was a four-star general, a legendary and somewhat feared figure in the defense community. He was the head of the entire U.S. Cyber Command. For him to be personally calling a captain was unheard of. The smug look on Marcus's face flickered, replaced by a shadow of confusion. "I'm calling to personally inform you," General Peterson's voice continued, crisp and clear, "that your Project Chimera has been approved for full-scale implementation across all NATO networks. The Joint Chiefs signed off on it this morning." The entire room was now dead silent, hanging on every word. "Congratulations, Captain," Peterson concluded. "This is a game changer for our strategic defense posture. A truly remarkable piece of work." Before Marcus or Victoria could process this stunning validation of my invisible work, General Campbell chose his moment to strike. He leaned forward slightly in his chair, his voice cutting through the stunned silence like a hot knife. "That's excellent news, General Peterson," Campbell said, his tone casual but carrying the weight of his own 3 stars. "And while I have you on the line, you might be interested to know that Colonel Marcus Moss here," he gestured towards my brother, "is planning to sell his mother's company, Moss Defense Dynamics, to Ares Global Security." Marcus's face went white. Victoria's eyes widened in panic. General Campbell wasn't finished. He delivered the killing blow. "The same Ares, I believe, that recently outsourced its server security to a third-party firm in a country well known for its state-sponsored hacking activities. Seems like a potential security risk for any company that handles sensitive NATO-related projects. Like, for instance, Project Chimera." The air was sucked out of the room. The 47 family members began whispering frantically to one another, their wall of unity crumbling into chaos. Marcus looked like he'd been physically struck, his jaw slack with disbelief. He had just been outflanked, his secret deal exposed not in a boardroom, but in front of a 4-star general from the Pentagon and his entire family. On the speakerphone, General Peterson's voice was now dangerously cold. "Is that so?" he said, the 2 words dripping with menace. "Interesting. We'll be looking into that." And then he hung up. The click of the disconnected line was like a gunshot in the silent room. The carefully constructed confidence of Marcus Moss had shattered. His reputation, the only currency he truly valued, was now under direct threat from the highest levels of the Pentagon. Mr. Morrison, a master of timing himself, seized the moment of chaos. He cleared his throat loudly, drawing all eyes to him. "Well," he announced, a slight, satisfied smile touching his lips. "That concludes the preliminary reading of the will." He looked directly at Marcus and Victoria, who were still reeling. "The final disposition of assets, particularly concerning a certain blind trust established by General Moss in 2009, will be revealed at the annual shareholders' meeting on March 15th. He closed the portfolio with a definitive snap. I stood up. For the first time, I looked directly at my brother, at the fear and rage that had replaced his arrogance, and for the first time in their presence, I allowed myself to smile. It wasn't the practiced, defensive smile they were used to. It was a real one. The battle had just begun. And I had won the first skirmish. March 15th arrived with the cold, gray promise of a Washington, D.C. winter reluctant to yield. The annual shareholders' meeting for Moss Defense Dynamics was held in the Grand Ballroom of the Four Seasons in Georgetown. The room was packed with investors, board members, and industry analysts, the entire ecosystem that revolved around the MDD empire. I took my seat in the front row, flanked by Mr. Morrison and General Campbell. I was calm. I was ready. The meeting began with a series of dry financial reports, but everyone knew what was coming. This was not a meeting. It was a coronation. Marcus, brimming with restored confidence, strode to the stage to deliver the keynote address. He was in his element, the warrior CEO, ready to claim his throne. A massive photo of him in the cockpit of an F-22, silhouetted against a fiery sunset, flashed on the screen behind him. Moss Defense Dynamics was built by warriors, for warriors, he began, his voice resonating with manufactured passion. My mother, General Eleanor Moss, understood that victory on the battlefield is all that matters. It's a legacy of strength, of tangible results. He paced the stage, owning every inch of it. It's time we trim the fat. It's time to get back to our core mission, led by those with true combat experience. As he said combat experience, his eyes briefly flickered to me, a glint of triumphant dismissal in his gaze. The message was clear. This company would be led by fighter pilots, not paper pushers. The shareholders, swayed by his charisma, applauded enthusiastically. He finished his speech with a flourish and a confident smile, basking in the applause. And in that precise moment, as the sound began to die down, I stood up and walked calmly towards the stage. A wave of confusion rippled through the room. Victoria, seeing me approach, moved to intercept me, her face a mask of fury. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed. She never got an answer. From the front row, General Campbell rose to his full height. His voice, trained to command armies, boomed through the ballroom without needing a microphone. "A shareholder has a right to be heard." The authority in his voice was absolute. He was not just a retired general, he was a respected four-star officer. Victoria froze, her power instantly checked by a greater one. The shareholders began to murmur, their curiosity piqued. The room fell silent. Victoria had no choice but to step back. I reached the podium and adjusted the microphone. I didn't look at my siblings. I looked out at the sea of faces, the investors, the board members, the people whose fortunes were tied to this company. My voice when I spoke was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the silent room. "My name is Captain Alicia Moss," I began. "And for my entire life, my family has told me that my contributions were invisible." I let the word hang in the air for a moment. Today, I'm here to make them visible. From the portfolio at my side, I removed a single, leather-bound document. I held it up for all to see. "This," I announced, my voice gaining strength, "is the certificate of ownership for the Eleanor Moss Blind Trust, established in 2009. A confused murmur spread through the audience. This trust was created by my mother to hold a significant portion of her personal shares, separate from the family estate. Per the terms of the trust, which were unsealed upon her death, I am, effective today, the sole beneficial owner of 35% of Moss Defense Dynamics." The room exploded. The murmurs became gasps, then shouts. 35%. It was a controlling stake. It was a corporate hydrogen bomb. Marcus's face contorted with rage. "Lies! That's fraud!" he bellowed from the side of the stage. "The will gave us control." But it was too late. Mr. Morrison was already walking to a technician's table. In an instant, the high-resolution legal documents, the trust agreement, my mother's signature, the official seals, flashed onto the giant screen behind me, replacing the heroic photo of Marcus. Every word was there, irrefutable and legally binding. The shareholders stared, dumbfounded, at the undeniable proof. Before the chaos could fully take hold, General Campbell calmly walked onto the stage and stood beside me. He addressed the shareholders with the calm authority of a battlefield commander. "For the past several years," he began, "Captain Moss has been one of the lead architects of the Pentagon's next-generation cyber defense initiative. Her work, much of which remains classified, has been instrumental in protecting this nation's most sensitive digital assets." He paused, then looked from Marcus to me. He delivered the final, devastating comparison. "Colonel Moss stops enemy planes," he said, his voice ringing with clarity. "Captain Moss stops wars before they begin. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, who do you want leading this company into the future?" The question hung in the air, a perfect, unanswerable indictment of my brother's worldview. And then, I delivered the final blow. "My mother left one last message," I said, pulling her letter from my pocket. "She wanted you all to hear it." I held my phone to the microphone. A moment later, the voice of General Eleanor Moss, weaker than they remembered but still filled with iron, filled the ballroom. It was a recording she had made with Mr. Morrison a year before her death. "To the shareholders and the family," her voice echoed, a ghost on the stage. "If you are hearing this, it means I am gone, and my children, Marcus and Victoria, have chosen a path of personal glory over the integrity of the company I built. I have watched them prioritize profits over people, headlines over honor. They are brilliant, but they are blinded by the glories of the past." Marcus and Victoria stood frozen, their faces ashen, forced to listen to their own mother's judgment. "The future is not in the sky," her voice continued with a tinge of sadness. "It is in the silence of the network. It is in the invisible battles fought every second of every day. That is why I have entrusted the future of my legacy to the only one of my children who could see it. I have entrusted it to my daughter, Alicia." The recording ended. A profound silence fell over the room. It was over. In less than 10 minutes, the Moss Empire had been overthrown. Marcus and Victoria stood like statues, their faces a mixture of shock, humiliation, and utter defeat. Their coronation had become their execution. The applause felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. I had won. The war was over. So, why did I feel so empty? The aftermath of the shareholders' meeting was a whirlwind. The story of the silent coup at MDD ripped through the Washington Beltway. Forbes ran a feature calling me the quiet strategist. The Wall Street Journal praised the move as a bold step into the future of defense technology. The market responded decisively. MDD stock soared 18% in a single day. A clear vote of confidence not in my name, but in the new direction my mother had charted. The world, it seemed, was finally ready to see me. The fallout for my siblings was just as swift and brutal. Marcus became a cautionary tale overnight. His secret negotiations with Ares Global Security were leaked to the press, and the Air Force launched a formal investigation into his conduct. He was stripped of his board seats, his command pending review, and his carefully crafted image as an American hero was irrevocably tarnished. His reputation as an ace pilot had been shot down, not by an enemy missile, but by a legal document and an audio recording. Victoria fared slightly better, but her power was neutered. The board, now firmly under my control with General Campbell appointed as the new chairman, began a top-to-bottom review of her executive decisions. She kept her title, but lost her authority. And then came the flood. My phone, which had been silent for years except for commands and summons, began to light up incessantly. Texts, voicemails, emails, a deluge of communication from the 47 members of the Moss clan. The same aunts, uncles, and cousins who had sat in stony silence at the will reading, whose eyes had slid past me as if I were a ghost, were now overflowing with sudden, miraculous affection. "Alicia, we are so proud of you," one text read. "We always knew you had it in you, dear," an email from an aunt gushed. The hypocrisy was so blatant it was almost nauseating. They weren't proud of me, they were terrified of my newfound power. They were scrambling to get on the right side of the new authority figure. Their praise was nothing more than a strategic realignment. I didn't feel anger. I just felt tired. So, one evening, I sat down with my laptop and a glass of wine. I didn't reply to a single message. Instead, I calmly and methodically began to erect my new defenses. I created a new filter in my email client. I named it Irrelevant. One by one, I added the email addresses of 45 family members to the filter, programming their messages to bypass my inbox and go directly into a folder I would never open. Then I went through my phone and blocked their numbers. 45 digital goodbyes. I left only 2 contacts untouched. My 2 younger cousins, the only ones who had sent me simple, heartfelt texts after Mom's funeral, asking if I was okay and saying they were thinking of me. They had offered kindness when it cost something. The rest had offered praise only when it could buy them something. The boundary was drawn. The silence I had once endured as a punishment, I now embraced as a choice. It was the sound of peace. 6 months passed. 6 months of rebuilding, of working with General Campbell to chart a new course for MDD, of focusing on innovation and integrity. Then, I received a formal request through my assistant. Marcus and Victoria wanted a meeting. I agreed, but on my terms. Not at a neutral location, not at a fancy restaurant. I chose the main boardroom at MDD headquarters. My turf. My table. When they walked in, I was struck by how much they had changed. They looked diminished. The arrogant swagger was gone from Marcus's walk. He looked haggard, the stress of the Air Force investigation having carved new lines into his face. Victoria's usual immaculate composure was frayed at the edges. There was a bitterness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. They sat opposite me at the long, polished table where my mother had once presided. I listened, my face a neutral mask as they made their pleas. Marcus, his voice strained, spoke of legacy and family honor. He asked for a new role, a position as a consultant, a way to contribute to the company his grandfather had founded. Victoria was more direct. She presented a plan to regain operational control over the manufacturing division, arguing that she was the only one who understood the supply chains well enough to manage them. I let them say everything they needed to say. I didn't interrupt. I just listened, watching them, seeing them not as the titans who had terrorized my childhood, but as two people who had lost their way, blinded by their own ambition. When the silence stretched out, indicating they had finally run out of arguments, I looked at them both. My voice was not angry. It was cold, clear, and final, like a military directive. No. The word landed on the table with the weight of a judge's gavel. Marcus, I said, addressing him directly, your access to this company and all its facilities is permanently revoked. Your actions put this entire enterprise and national security at risk. There is no place for you here. His face paled, but he said nothing. Victoria, I continued, turning to my sister, you will continue in your current role under the new chief operating officer I've appointed. Her name is Dr. Eris Thorne. You will report to her, and she will report to me. Your authority will extend no further than what she delegates. I let that sink in for a moment before delivering the final lesson. You both spent your lives teaching me a very specific lesson about our family, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. You taught me that in the Moss dynasty, rank and performance are all that matter. Affection is conditional. Loyalty is transactional. All that matters is who is in command. I stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. I'm simply enforcing the new chain of command. The meeting is over. I turned and walked out of the boardroom without looking back. Walking down the long hallway, past the portraits of my grandfather and my mother, I didn't feel the thrill of victory I expected. I just felt quiet. I had secured the company, protected the legacy, and established a new order. But I had also formalized the death of my family. The question that haunted me wasn't, what's next for the company, but what's next for me? What does a legacy truly mean when you're the only one left to carry it? The question that echoed in the quiet aftermath of my victory. What does a legacy truly mean? Didn't find its answer in a boardroom or a stock portfolio. It found its answer in the quiet, steady work that followed. Under my new leadership, with General Campbell as chairman, Moss Defense dynamics began to change from the inside out. We shifted our focus from short-term profits to long-term innovation, prioritizing the quality of our equipment and the safety of the soldiers who depended on it. But my first major act as the new controlling shareholder wasn't a corporate restructuring. It was the establishment of the Eleanor Moss Veteran Innovation Initiative. It was a multi-million-dollar fund dedicated to providing capital and mentorship to veteran-led startups. This wasn't just charity, it was a mission. It was my answer to the question that haunted me. I didn't just sign the checks. I made time every single week to personally mentor the entrepreneurs. One afternoon, a young Marine captain named Jenna Riley came into my office. She was sharp, determined, and had a brilliant idea for a new series of autonomous surveillance drones. But she was discouraged. Every venture capital firm I pitch to, it's a room full of men who look at me and see a girl playing with toys, she confessed, her frustration palpable. They don't see a Marine officer. They don't see the vision. I looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, and I saw a reflection of myself. I saw the same dismissal, the same quiet competence being overlooked. In that moment, my legacy became clear. It wasn't about holding on to power, it was about giving it to those who had earned it but were being denied it. I didn't just fund her project, I became her mentor. I became for her what General Campbell had been for me, a voice that said, I see you. My own life found a new, quieter rhythm. I made the decision to remain in the Army, to continue my service. My work at Cyber Command was more than a job. It was my true calling, the place where I belonged, defined by my skills, not my last name. I managed MDD from a strategic distance, entrusting the day-to-day operations to General Campbell and the new COO I had hired, a brilliant woman from MIT. My weekends changed too. The invitations to DC galas and political fundraisers were politely declined. Instead, on Saturdays, I'd get into my old Jeep Wrangler, the one with the faded paint and perpetually muddy floor mats, and drive west, out to the Blue Ridge Mountains. I'd spend my days hiking the trails of Shenandoah, the only sounds being the rustle of leaves, the call of a distant hawk, and my own steady breathing. Out there, surrounded by the ancient, silent wisdom of the mountains, I found a sense of peace that no amount of corporate victory could ever provide. I was finally breathing my own air. 1 year to the day after the shareholders' meeting, I found myself back at Arlington National Cemetery. I walked the familiar path to my mother's grave, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the endless rows of white stone. I knelt and placed a small bouquet of wildflowers I'd picked that morning on the grass. This time, there was no anger. There was no cold fury, no lingering ache of betrayal. There was only a profound and quiet gratitude. Staring at her name carved into the marble, Eleanor Moss, Brigadier General, I finally understood the last, most brilliant move of her long career. The greatest gift she had left me wasn't 35% of a company. It was the war itself. She hadn't left me a fortune. She had left me a crucible. A battle designed to force me to become the woman she knew I could be. She had given me a fight so that I could finally find my own strength. In her old field notebook, which Mr. Morrison had given me, I found a passage from the Bible she had underlined. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future." My painful journey had been part of that plan. A legacy, I realized, isn't something you inherit. It's what you choose to build with the pieces you're given. I stood and looked out across the hallowed grounds, my gaze settling on the distant, majestic form of the Lincoln Memorial. For the first time in my life, I felt no need to prove anything to anyone. I was at peace with all the parts of myself: the soldier, the strategist, the leader, the daughter who had, in the end, fulfilled her mother's final mission. I whispered the words into the gentle breeze, a final report to my old commander, and a promise to myself. It's not about proving them wrong. It's about being true to the vision they were too blind to see. I turned and walked away from the grave, my steps steady and sure. I was no longer the heir to an empire built by others. I was the architect of my own. My dawn was just beginning. Thank you for listening to my journey. My dawn is just beginning, and I truly believe that everyone, no matter what they've endured, has the power to create their own. The greatest lesson I learned is that we are the architects of our own legacy, built not from what we inherit, but from what we overcome. I'd be honored to hear about yours. In the comments below, please share one word that defines the legacy you're building for yourself. If you believe in the power of turning pain into purpose, please subscribe to this channel. It's a place for stories like ours, stories of resilience and rebirth. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.